There's a new film coming out that you've been involved with. What's it called and what's it about?
So the movie's produced by the Clarion Fund, which major focus is dealing with the threat of radical Islam to Western civilization in the United States and Israel. And it's called The Honor Diaries. And it specifically focuses on the issue of Islamic treatment of women, which is an issue that is huge and basically too politically incorrect for most people to be willing to deal with, but a very important issue to understand how Islam treats women.
What was your role in it?
The point is, I wasn't involved in making. I'm not involved in making the movie. I tried to say that before. I work for an organization called JerusalemU, and one of these, I would say, other organizations associated called the Clarion Fund. It happens to be my brother-in-law, Rafael Shore, who is the director, president of both organizations. So, insofar as it's in my office space, that's how I know about it. But
in Toronto?
It's where we do our production is done largely. Much of it is done in Israel, in Jerusalem.
Okay. Did you get any Israeli Arab women or Palestinian Muslim women to participate in the film, or what kind of people are in it?
In that movie, we have 8 Muslim or formerly Muslim women who actually get together. You see them sitting in a room together, discussing various issues related to their personal lives or basic issues in the Islamic world, such as honor killings or the incredible restrictions that women have in many Islamic societies, like inability to drive or even be seen in public, like in Saudi Arabia, without a male escort, like a close relative, that kind of thing. So it's not so much focusing on Palestinian issues, but more Arab women from around the world. Some of them are from countries like Pakistan, or even parts of Africa and various places in the Middle East.
Why was this an issue to be made by the Clarion Fund or project?
Because one of the many of the films the Clarion Fund focuses on is different aspects of the impact of Islam on civilization, and people need to be aware that as not only within the Arab world, but as Islam spreads around the world, this has implications for human rights and many basic issues which are taken for granted in Western civilization and shouldn't be.
How are minorities treated under fundamental Islam?
Well, Islam being a very legalistic religion defines non-Muslims, and the concept of what's called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, is a very important concept for Westerners to understand. Non-Muslim monotheists are allowed to live in Islamic countries or countries dominated by Islam and allowed to practice their religion, but they're subject to really a form of Islamic apartheid, with restrictions and special taxes and humiliating regulations that are designed to keep them under the thumb of Islam, and they have to recognize their place as inferior status.
Is there a connection between the way Islam treats women and other minorities, such as dhimmis would be Christians, Jews, atheists, Zoroastrians, Hindus? Is there a connection between that and the notion of a Jewish state of Israel extant within the Islamic geographical region?
Basically, if you condense Islamic worldview down into a couple basic points, that which becomes what's called Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, has to always remain that and can never revert back to it. And dhimmi, Jews, Christians, or in the case of Israel, Jews, are never allowed to rule over Muslims. So from a theological perspective, a Jewish state is unacceptable and impossible. And that's an idea which is always overlooked and never talked about.
You mean like anathema?
Impossible from a theological perspective. It cannot be allowed to exist, which means that forget the smokescreen of Palestinian national claims on a theological level. The real issue is much more fundamental, theological, and basic. So unless Islam were to go through some sort of, as we'd say, chilling out or revision of its theology, a Jewish state would be impossible and be unacceptable, which speaks much more to the lack of a peace process than any of the other supposed superficial issues like Palestinian claims to the land.
Nice. He's the director, so he gets that privilege. To what extent do you feel that the Israelis, who are mostly led by secular politicians, a secular government, to what extent do you feel that they are cognizant of the cause of the rejection of the Arab world and the Palestinian state in their hopes and aspirations for a cessation of hostilities through cessation of territory?
I don't think most Israelis are aware of those issues. Israelis, even though they live in a Middle East which is overwhelmingly Arab and Islamic, tend to also have not the broadest or deepest perspective on Islamic worldview. What I do think that most Israelis get is the fact that it has nothing to do with the creation of a Palestinian state, which Palestinians have rejected always and every opportunity, but rather about the inability of the Palestinians and the Arabs to accept a Jewish state of any size. So while they might lack the specific theological understanding of why that is so, I think the majority of Israelis understand that the peace process is just an exercise in theatrics, and their rejection of Israel is something much, much deeper.
So when Prime Minister Netanyahu says we promote two states for two people, how much does he believe in that, honestly, you think?
I would say in terms of putting odds on it happening, he wouldn't get a Las Vegas bookie to put very high odds on that happening. I think he recognizes that for Western consumption, you got to play the game. And really, in the peace process, since Israel keeps offering and the Arabs keep rejecting it, it's more a question of in whose ball will the court be when the negotiations end. But sadly, I'm not saying that Netanyahu and a good percentage of Israelis wouldn't be really happy and even willing to compromise territorially for real peace, but it's a recognition that really that isn't the issue, and the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size is the issue. But nonetheless, we have to keep playing the game, even though the results are pretty much laid out before us well in advance.
But if Israel were to agree to a Palestinian state under the pressure of the U.S. or EU or UN, if they were to agree to this Palestinian state, how much would you trust the Palestinians to stop the terror groups which would operate in the same way that Afghanistan or Iraq doesn't stop the terrorism which takes place that the police supposedly can't stop?
Well, there's two issues there that I think override any considerations. Number one is Palestinians can't make peace. Not because they're Palestinians, but because they're totalitarian. And all totalitarian regimes can only exist in a state of perceived conflict with an external force, which is why when someone like Gorbachev ended the Cold War, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Yasser Arafat is on record as saying, the day I make peace with Israel is the last day that I'm alive. That's number one point. But the other issue is, as a historian, I will tell you that only democracy produces peace. The fact that no democracy has ever gone to war with another democracy is a very strong indicator that when you're dealing with a totalitarian regime, the piece of paper they signed the peace treaty on isn't worth the paper it's written on. Just like Hitler making a deal with Chamberlain in 1938 and him waiving the peace in our lifetime thing. Totalitarian regimes, you're making peace with an individual who can violate that peace treaty whenever it's expedient for him to do that. Amongst democracies, it's peace between peoples. It's binding, and people don't want to kill each other generally. So if you combine those two factors, the perceived state of conflict has to always exist, combined with the fact that they're not democratic, the chance of a peace process happening is almost nil, and even if it were to happen, that it'd be worth anything is less than nil.
If that's true, then how safe will Israelis ever be from Arabs or Muslims who live in Israel proper today?
So look, the Arabs within Israel are going to have to make a decision where they're, unfortunately, most of them are moving towards being Palestinianized. If they were asked to vote with their feet, they have to live in Palestinian state or Jewish state, they'd still stay in the Jewish state and be largely disloyal citizens. But in terms of Israel, people say, well, that means we're going to be locked in a perpetual conflict forever. And, I tell people, and I've spoken to some of the biggest people involved in the Oslo peace process. I'm not exaggerating. And they always throw the same lines out at me. We don't want our grandchildren to be fighting the same war that our grandparents were fighting. And I say that's great as long as both sides feel that way. But until both sides feel that way, you have to be willing to fight for 100 generations. And thank God history proves that totalitarian regimes, evil, and societies that are into destruction and death don't win. And you just have to have the courage and the strength to outlast them and be willing and to recognize that your claims are right and you're justified in defending yourself. And if you do that, then you're successful.
outlast what, the nationalist initiative?
With the Arab world, you can see is despite all the negativity, there's been many changes in the Arab world. Despite the lack of Arab Spring really appearing, what we do see in the Arab world, and it's moving very slowly, is a genuine recognition that things have to change. And we live in hope, although it's small now, but it is growing, that there will be a paradigm shift in the collective consciousness of the Arab Islamic world. 1,000 years ago, the Christian world was pretty backward, violent, and repressive, and intolerant. And look what they went through. And you have, maybe they went too far today and are post-Christian, and we could use a little more of that old-time religion. But although it's a long shot and it could take a long time, I do hold out. The only hope is that the Arab world, from the bottom up, not the top down, goes through such a process. And when they start to become more, I wouldn't say westernized, but more open and into the ideas of democracy and those concepts, then we'll see a real change in the Middle East, we hope.
But the notion that the Palestinians hold elections, that they elected Hamas, that they elected Abbas, does that make them a democratic society?
No, because they elected, when you elect people who don't believe in a democratic process, it's like Russia electing Putin. It's the same thing. They pay lip service to the concept, but when those people get in power, they then rob you of the rights that they gave on you to elect them to power. And it comes out of a sort of, I would say, a kind of a primitive or puerile understanding of what democracy is about, or not really having any choices. Because if you ask the average Palestinian in the street what they think about the democratic processes and freedoms within, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, they don't get very high marks. And ironically, as much as they hate Israel, and I've seen this in the studies, they give Israel tremendously high marks for being a functioning democracy. And they see in what goes on in Israel, as much as they hate the Jews, the fact that these people have free press and free speech and really vote, and their opinions matter.
And that's the big issue. A president like Navon could be brought down on a scandal, for example.
Right. They appreciate, and what they do see is the corruption and the cynicism within the people who are representing them, where they see that Israel is not a perfect society, but people are held accountable. And that's a big difference. And, Israel's existence serves as a constant. That's what really bothers them, that in the middle of this corrupt, degenerate, non-productive, oil-based, terrorist-breeding Middle East that we have is one society that blooms and produces and is like a little furnace of creativity and productivity and innovation. So it's got to be, I think, in the mind of many of our biggest detractors, they have to be seeing there's something going on there, that even though they don't like it, they respect it.
And in the Middle East, is it better to be respected than liked?
You need to be, in the Middle East, when you're dealing with the Arab mentality, it's much more important you're respected and even feared. That's Arab Islamic, pre-Islamic Arab worldview. They respect power, honor, and the sexual fidelity of their women are the three overarching ideas that run the Middle East and the Arab world. But the perception of power, negotiating and giving things away is a sign of weakness. You never want to do that in the Middle East.
Not in a market bazaar and not in a negotiating table?
You want to begin with a position of exaggerated demands and work into a compromised position. Would that we remembered that when we negotiated as well as you remember when we're buying something in the marketplace.
You think that's how the Palestinians are negotiating?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They understand it. They make outrageous demands constantly, to the point of rewriting history.
If they were to concede Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, how much would you trust them?
Not at all. But it's amazing that they don't even have the sophistication politically to recognize that just making a few empty statements would get them a lot of traction and put a lot of pressure on Israel. And I respect the ones who are more honest, and I respect someone like Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas more than I respect Mahmoud Abbas. They both hate us and want us destroyed. But Mahmoud Abbas, for the sake of getting some good PR amongst Europeans and America, will say things that he doesn't mean to make himself look better. Whereas at least a guy like Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas in Gaza is honest. And I prefer the honesty any day.
Maybe he's just not as big a crook. But the abscondable foreign aid?
Also be true, as a matter of fact. I would think the corruption amongst Hamas is probably on a lower level than amongst the Palestinian Authority.
How corrupt was Yasser Arafat?
Incredibly corrupt. He had personal wealth of an incredible amount.
And where did he steal it? I mean, where did he get it?
He was basically absconding with all the foreign aid. The Palestinians are per capita the largest recipients of foreign aid on the planet Earth. UNRWA, the UN organization dealing with them, has a larger budget than all other UN relief agencies for refugees around the world combined. It's a huge market.
So why would a Palestinian leadership cut off that gravy train?
They wouldn't. It's a society that's not based on being straight in business. It's not in the culture, sadly. It's part of that whole process of not having a culture of democracy or free market capitalism or behaving correctly. It's one-upmanship. If you can get away with it, you do it.
You think Obama doesn't know that he's naive?
I don't know how naive he is, but I think he has a specific political agenda where he's willing to overlook that.
What do you think that agenda is?
I basically think that his agenda is to downsize America. And
in terms of power,
remove it from its vision of being the world's policeman, and it's sort of a post-colonial reaction that we saw in Europe. I think is trying to reproduce in the United States.
But during a natural disaster, if there's no police, then looting abounds. So the U.S. is not the policeman. Then the bad guys will go wild.
That's the scary part. If America doesn't do it, who's going to do it? The French certainly are not going to. So it represents one of the greatest threats to the stability of the world today. When evil is on the rise and radicalism, to have a country like America, whose defense budget is greater than the next 15 countries in the world after it combined, saying we're going to just downsize our army and downsize our commitments to, and downsize our foreign aid, and that's very, very dangerous. I'm going to have to call because it's really late.
Thank you very much.
Okay.